Abandoned on a dying world, Rhea sat on the cold, cracked ground, staring at the dark sky above. The twin moons of Hera-7 shone dimly, their light barely reaching the lifeless surface of the planet. The wind howled through the empty wasteland, carrying dust and the scent of decay. She was alone. Her ship was gone, taken by the same people she once called her own. The Zephyrians, her species, had left her behind without hesitation. They didn't even look back. She remembered the moment clearly. The emergency sirens blaring, the ship's engines roaring as they lifted off, leaving her in the dust. She had screamed, begged them to wait. But the Zephyrians had no use for the weak. Her injuries slowed her down, and in their eyes, she was already dead. Now she had no food, no shelter, no hope. Rhea pulled her tattered cloak tighter around herself, trying to shield her body from the icy wind. Her long violet skin was bruised, her once bright silver eyes dull with exhaustion. She had sent distress signals to every nearby ship, but the responses were always the same. No resources to spare, no room for another mouth, no one coming. She gritted her teeth. In the great galactic empire, where thousands of species thrived, she had thought someone, anyone, would help her. But no alien wanted to waste their time on a useless, abandoned outcast. She wasn't important. She wasn't worth saving. Her stomach growled, the hunger pains sharp and unforgiving. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaking from weakness. She had to find something to eat or she wouldn't last another day. The planet was a wasteland. Once, Sirius-7 had been full of life, but now it was nothing but ruins and dust. The air was thin, and most creatures had long died or fled. The only ones left were predators, hungry, desperate beings that would kill her the moment they saw her. She moved carefully, stepping over jagged rocks and broken metal scraps. In the distance, the remains of an old crash site caught her eye. Maybe, just maybe, there were supplies left behind. Hope was a dangerous thing, but she had nothing else. As she reached the wreckage, her fingers trembled with exhaustion. She dug through the broken panels, searching for anything, food, water, even a working communicator. But there was nothing, only rusted metal and shattered glass. Her heart sank. She slumped against a large piece of wreckage, pressing her forehead against the cold surface. She was so tired. Maybe this was the end. Maybe it was better to just. A sound. Her eyes snapped open. Footsteps. Her breath caught in her throat. Something was coming toward her. She pressed herself against the wreckage, her pulse racing. She reached for the small knife hidden in her belt. Not much, but better than nothing. The footsteps grew closer, crunching against the dry ground. Not fast, not slow, steady, deliberate. Then a voice, deep, calm, human. You don't look so good. Rhea's eyes widened. A human. Here. She turned her head slowly. Standing a few feet away was a tall figure, wrapped in rough, patched-up clothing. His face was partially hidden behind a cloth mask, but his eyes were sharp and steady. His hair was messy, his boots covered in dust. He carried a pack on his back and a metal tool in one hand, part weapon, part walking stick. Rhea had never met a human before. She had heard stories, though. Humans were strange, reckless, unpredictable. Some called them dangerous. Others called them survivors. She swallowed hard, gripping her knife. Was he friend or foe? The man tilted his head slightly, as if reading her thoughts. Then, with slow, careful movements, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small silver container. Water. He tossed it toward her. She caught it instinctively, staring at the bottle as if it were a miracle. "Drink," he said simply. Rhea hesitated. Was this a trick? A trap? But her throat was so dry, her body so weak. If he wanted to harm her, he already had the chance. She twisted the cap and took a small sip. The cool liquid burned down her throat, shocking her system back to life. She drank again, this time longer, her body aching with relief. The human watched her but said nothing. Finally, she wiped her mouth and looked up at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Why what?" he replied. "Why help me?" No one else had. No alien had even considered it. The human shrugged, adjusting the strap on his pack. His eyes met hers, calm but serious. "No one should be left to die alone," he said simply. Rhea stared at him, trying to understand. For the first time in days, she felt something strange. Something she hadn't expected. Hope, the unexpected human. The silence between them stretched. Rhea clutched the water bottle, her mind struggling to process the moment. For days, she had called for help, and no alien had answered. Yet here stood a human, offering aid without hesitation. Who was he? Why was he here? The wind howled across the wasteland, whipping up dust between them. The human adjusted the strap of his pack and looked at her with calm, steady eyes, as if he had all the time in the universe. "You gonna just sit there, or do you want to live?" he asked. Rhea's fingers tightened around the bottle. His words stirred something inside her. Anger, maybe. A small spark of defiance. She had spent too long being ignored, too long begging for mercy. Now this man spoke to her as if she had a choice. She pushed herself up, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The weight of hunger, thirst, and hopelessness pressed down on her, but she refused to let herself fall again. The human gave a small nod, approving. He didn't offer a hand to help, but he waited, giving her the time she needed. "Who are you?" she asked. "David," he said simply. "You?" She hesitated. A Zypherian name meant nothing here. She was no longer part of their world. "Rhea." "All right, Rhea. Let's go." He turned and started walking without another word. Rhea blinked. That was it? No interrogation, no suspicion, no demands. "Go where?" she called after him. David didn't stop. "Away from here," he said over his shoulder. "You stay in the open too long, and something's gonna eat you." Rhea glanced around the barren landscape, her skin prickling. She had seen shadows moving in the distance, strange creatures lurking in the ruins. She didn't know what they were, but she had no interest in finding out. Gritting her teeth, she followed. The humans' shelter. They walked for what felt like hours. Rhea's body screamed for rest. But David never slowed. He moved like someone used to hardship, his pace steady, his eyes always scanning the horizon. Finally, they reached a small outcropping of jagged rocks. Hidden between them was a makeshift shelter built from salvaged metal and scraps. It was no advanced structure, just stitched together panels and reinforced beams. But to Rhea, it might as well have been a palace. "This is where you live?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. David shrugged, stepping inside. "Better than out there," he said. Rhea followed, ducking through the low entrance. Inside, the shelter was cramped but organized. A single cot made from scavenged material sat against one wall. A small fire pit glowed with warmth. Crates of supplies, water canisters, tools, scraps of technology were stacked neatly. It was nothing like the towering city she had grown up in, where machines did everything and no one needed to struggle. Yet this tiny place had something her old life never did: real survival. David sat on an overturned crate, pulling off his boots. He didn't speak for a while, just let her take in her surroundings. Rhea felt awkward, out of place, like a child stepping into a new world. "Sit," he said finally, motioning toward another crate. She hesitated, then obeyed. David rummaged through his supplies and tossed her a protein bar. She caught it clumsily, staring at the dull gray wrapper. It wasn't Zypherian food. There was no careful balance of nutrients, no elegant design. It was plain, practical, human-made. Her stomach twisted painfully. She didn't care what it looked like. She tore it open and took a bite. It was dry, bland, and slightly bitter. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Slow down," David muttered, watching her practically inhale the food. "You'll make yourself sick." Rhea forced herself to chew slower. "You didn't ask me why I'm here," she said between bites. David leaned back, arms resting on his knees. "Does it matter?" She frowned. "It does to me." He studied her for a moment, then sighed. "People get left behind all the time," he said simply. "It's nothing new." Rhea stiffened. He knew. Maybe not the details, but he had seen enough to understand. "And you?" she asked. "Why are you here?" David was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "I got tired of looking for a place that wanted me." Rhea stared at him, surprised. Wasn't that what had happened to her? For the first time, she saw David not just as a strange human, but as someone like her, a survivor. Lessons in survival. The next morning, Rhea woke to the sound of metal clanking. David was outside, working. She stepped out of the shelter, blinking against the pale light of the rising suns. David was busy reinforcing the shelter walls, hammering makeshift metal sheets into place. He moved with a quiet determination, his hands rough, his expression focused. "You always work this hard?" she asked, still groggy. "Only if I want to live." Rhea watched him for a moment. The way he built, adjusted, fixed, it was so human. Zephyrians relied on machines. Humans used their hands. She wasn't sure which was stronger. David glanced at her. "You gonna just stand there, or you wanna help?" Rhea hesitated. She had never built anything in her life. But something in David's tone challenged her. She stepped forward. "What do I do?" David grinned, tossing her a tool. "Figure it out." And for the first time, Rhea did. A home from ruins. Rhea had never built anything with her own hands before. She had grown up in a world where machines handled everything. Zephyrians didn't construct. They commanded. Buildings rose at the touch of a button. Food was synthesized with perfect nutritional balance, and robots maintained every aspect of daily life. But here, a man, just one man, had built himself a shelter from the wreckage of a dead planet. And now, for the first time, she was part of that process. She tightened her grip on the metal tool David had tossed her and turned the small hunk of scrap in her hands. She had no idea where to even begin. David watched her struggle, shaking his head with a slight smirk. "You're overthinking it," he said. "It's not about doing it perfectly. It's about making it work." He knelt next to a section of the wall, pointing to a gap where the wind whistled through. "See this? If we don't fix it, the next storm will rip this place apart. So we take a piece of metal, bend it, patch it up. Doesn't have to be pretty, just has to hold." Rhea hesitated, then mimicked his movements. Her first attempt was a failure. The metal slipped from her fingers, landing in the dust. David sighed, picked it up, and handed it back to her. Again. She gritted her teeth. This was humiliating. A Zephyrian struggling with basic manual labor. But something inside her refused to quit. She bent the metal again, forcing it into place. This time, it stuck. It wasn't perfect, but when she pressed against it, it held firm. David nodded approvingly. "Not bad." Rhea felt something strange inside her, something she hadn't felt since she was abandoned. Pride. The human way. Days passed. Rhea learned through mistakes, through trial and error. David never coddled her. When she got something wrong, he simply told her to do it again. When she got something right, he barely acknowledged it, just a small nod, a grunt of approval. At first, it infuriated her, but then she realized this was how humans lived. They didn't rely on technology to make things easy. They failed, they learned, and they adapted. And so, she did the same. She reinforced the shelter's walls, helped build a proper fire pit, and even worked on a crude water filtration system using scavenged materials. It was slow, frustrating work, but every small victory felt real. For the first time in her life, she was creating something. And it changed her. The storm that tested them. One evening, as Raya and David sat by the fire, eating the last of the ration bars, the wind picked up. David glanced up at the sky, frowning. Storm's coming. Raya followed his gaze. Dark clouds churned above, thick and heavy. She had seen storms on this planet before, but nothing like this. How bad? She asked. David was already standing, grabbing supplies. Bad. The wind howled louder, and in the distance, Raya could see a massive wall of dust and debris rushing toward them. Her heart pounded. This storm would destroy everything they had built. David moved fast. He grabbed extra metal sheets, reinforcing the shelter's weak spots. Raya scrambled to help, but the wind was already roaring, ripping through the air like a beast. She barely had time to throw herself inside before the full force of the storm slammed into them. The shelter shook violently. Metal creaked, dust filled the air, and for a terrifying moment, Raya was sure the whole thing would collapse. Then, a loud snap. One of the walls started to tear loose. David lunged forward, pressing his weight against it, trying to keep it in place. "Raya," he shouted over the storm. "Help me." She hesitated for just a second, her mind screaming at her to run, to find cover. That was what Cypherians did. They let machines handle danger. They avoided struggle. But humans fought. Something inside her snapped. She rushed forward, pressing against the wall alongside him. The wind pushed harder, but they pushed back. Minutes stretched into eternity, but they held the shelter together, refusing to let it fall. Finally, after what felt like forever, the storm began to fade. The wind weakened, the dust settled, and an eerie silence fell over the wasteland. Raya gasped for breath, her muscles aching. She looked at David, who was equally exhausted, but grinning. "Not bad," he said, echoing his words from before. Raya let out a weak laugh. They had survived. A new understanding. The storm had damaged part of the shelter, but it was still standing. Raya sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, feeling something foreign and unfamiliar in her chest. David sat across from her, sharpening a piece of scrap into a makeshift tool. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. For the first time, Raya realized something. She had spent her whole life believing that strength came from technology, from intelligence, from power. But humans were different. They had no great machines to protect them, no advanced knowledge to save them from hardship. They only had themselves. And somehow, that was enough. Raya looked at her hands, calloused now, rough from work, not soft and weak like before. She wasn't the same person who had been left behind. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning how to live. And it was all because of one stubborn human who refused to let the universe break him. The harsh reality. Raya had thought the worst was over. She had fought against hunger. She had battled exhaustion. She had survived a storm that could have torn her apart. But nothing had prepared her for the long, merciless grind of survival. Life in the wasteland. Days turned into weeks. The planet's barren wasteland stretched endlessly in every direction, a graveyard of rusted metal and forgotten ruins. Food was a constant battle. David had some supplies, but not enough to last forever. They had to scavenge, dig through wreckage, search for anything edible, hunt for what little life remained. At first, Raya was useless. She didn't know how to find food. She didn't know what plants were poisonous or safe. She couldn't track, hunt, or fish. And David, he refused to spoon-feed her. "Figure it out," he said when she asked how to find food. "Watch, then do it yourself," he muttered when he built traps for small creatures. Raya hated him for it. She wanted him to explain things properly, to guide her, to make it easy. But David wasn't like the Cypherians. He didn't believe in easy. And so, Raya learned the hard way. She failed, again and again. She burned food, she broke traps. She nearly poisoned herself eating a plant that looked harmless. David never yelled, never scolded. He just gave her a look, one that said, "You knew better than that." And slowly, painfully, Rhea started to understand. Survival wasn't about being the strongest or having the best technology. It was about learning, adapting, overcoming. And humans did it better than anyone. The things that hunt in the dark. One night, as they sat by the fire, David suddenly stiffened. His eyes flicked to the darkness beyond the shelter, his body going tense. Rhea noticed it immediately. "What is it?" she whispered. David didn't respond. Then she heard it, a low, rumbling growl. It came from beyond the fire's glow, deep in the shadows where the wind howled through the ruins. The sound was low and guttural, vibrating through the air like a warning. Rhea felt a chill crawl up her spine. David reached for his weapon, a crude, self-made spear sharpened from scrap metal. "Stay quiet," he murmured. "Don't move." The growl came again, closer this time. Then, glowing eyes appeared in the dark. A creature, low to the ground, its body rippling with muscle. Its black, leathery skin blended into the shadows, but its eyes burned like embers. And then another, and another. A pack. "Night stalkers," David whispered. "They don't attack alone. They test you first." Rhea's heart pounded. The lead creature stepped forward, its sharp claws scraping against rock. It was fast, powerful, and hungry. David didn't move. The fire crackled between them, the only thing keeping the beasts at bay. "They're waiting for us to run," David muttered. "If we run, we die." Rhea swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to run for her life. But she forced herself to stay still. The lead night stalker circled the fire, testing their resolve. Sniffing, watching, waiting. Then, David moved first. With a sudden motion, he threw a burning piece of wood straight at the beast's feet. The flames sparked and the creature recoiled, hissing. The others growled in response, but they hesitated. David took a step forward, brandishing his spear. "Not worth the fight, is it?" he said calmly. The lead creature bared its fangs, then let out a sharp, guttural snarl. A moment later, the pack melted back into the shadows. Rhea exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was," she started. "Close," David finished. The fire crackled between them again, but now, the night felt even darker. "Why do you keep fighting?" Later, after the tension had faded, Rhea finally asked something she had been wondering for days. "Why do you do this?" she said, looking at David. "Do what?" "Fight, build, survive." She gestured around. "No one is coming for you. No one cares. Why keep going?" David didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "Because if I stop, I die." Rhea frowned. "So that's it? That's the only reason?" David shook his head. "No. The truth is," he sighed, rubbing his hands together, "I don't know how to quit. I don't know how to give up. It's just not what we do. Humans." David smirked. "Yeah." Rhea looked at him, really looked at him. The exhaustion in his face, the scars on his hands, the fire in his eyes. David wasn't stronger than Zephyrians. He wasn't faster or smarter than other species, but he was something else, something more dangerous than any creature in the wasteland. He refused to break, a different kind of strength. That night, as Rhea lay on her cot, listening to the wind outside, she felt something shift inside her. For so long, she had believed her people were superior. Zephyrians had advanced ships, powerful weapons, endless resources, and yet they had abandoned her. David had nothing. No technology, no weapons, no homeworld waiting for him. But he was still here, still fighting. And so, for the first time in her life, Rhea thought, Maybe humans weren't as weak as the galaxy believed. Maybe they were the strongest of all. The threat from above. It started with a faint hum in the air. Raya's sharp hearing picked it up before David did. A vibration, faint at first, but growing louder. She stood at the edge of their makeshift camp, squinting against the dusty horizon. The wind had picked up again, scattering particles in the dull orange light of Ira 7's twin suns. David was nearby, working on yet another repair to their battered water filter. "David," she said, her voice low but urgent. He looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What? Do you hear that?" David tilted his head, listening. At first, nothing, just the usual hiss of the wind and the occasional creak of their patched-together shelter. But then, as the hum grew louder, his expression darkened. "Engines," he muttered, "a shadow in the sky." They both spotted it at the same time. A ship, sleek, black and fast. It broke through the haze like a predator, swooping low over the wasteland. The craft's design was unmistakably alien. Sharp angles, glimmering blue thrusters, and a menacing silhouette. David grabbed his crude spear, though they both knew it would be useless against something like that. "Stay close," he said, his voice tight. "If it lands, we need to stay hidden. Don't trust anyone." Raya didn't argue. The ship circled once, then slowed, coming to a hover above the rocky ground near their shelter. The dust kicked up in swirling clouds as it descended. When it landed, the hum of the engines faded, replaced by an eerie silence. David glanced at Raya. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his grip tightened on the spear. He was ready for trouble. The hatch on the ship's side slid open with a sharp hiss. Unwanted visitors. A group of alien scavengers emerged. They were a mix of species, tall, lean figures with elongated limbs, sharp claws, and faces covered in battle-worn armor. They moved like they owned the place, confident and aggressive. Their leader, a broad-shouldered alien with glowing yellow eyes, stepped forward. His voice was deep, raspy, and laced with condescension. "What have we here?" he said, scanning the crude shelter and its inhabitants, a little outpost of survivors. David didn't respond. He didn't move. Raya's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the scavengers' gazes. They were predators, and she and David were prey. The leader tilted his head, looking at Raya. "A Zephyrian." He laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Your people left you behind, didn't they? Typical. Weak and expendable." Raya felt a surge of anger, but she bit her tongue. She couldn't give them a reason to attack. "And you," the leader said, turning to David. "A human. What are you even doing here? This isn't your fight." David's grip on his spear didn't waver. He stared at the leader, his voice calm but firm. "You don't belong here," he said. "Move on." The scavenger's glowing eyes narrowed. "Is that so? You've built something here. That means you've got supplies. Water, maybe food. We'll just take what we need and leave you to your dirt." He stepped forward, but David shifted slightly, planting himself more firmly between the scavengers and the shelter. "There's nothing here for you," David said. The leader chuckled, shaking his head. "Humans," he muttered, "always so stubborn. You think you can stop us?" The line in the sand. Raya's mind raced. She had heard of scavenger bands before. Ruthless, desperate creatures who took what they wanted and killed anyone who resisted. They didn't care about alliances, politics, or rules. They were survivors in the worst way, thriving on others' misfortune. But David wasn't budging. She wanted to say something, to tell him to stand down. They couldn't fight these aliens, not with a spear and a few scavenge tools. It was suicide. Yet David's gaze never faltered. "You take one step closer," he said, his voice low and steady, "and you'll regret it." The leader's smirk faded. For the first time, he looked uncertain. It wasn't that David had the better weapon or greater strength. It was something else, a look in his eyes that said he wasn't afraid. Rhea realized something in that moment. Humans didn't run from a fight. Even when the odds were impossible, they stood their ground. And that scared the scavengers. A dangerous choice. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours. The scavengers muttered among themselves, their confidence shaken. The leader glanced back at his crew, then at David. "Fine," he said finally. "Keep your scraps. We'll find what we need elsewhere." Rhea's knees nearly gave out with relief. The aliens backed off, boarding their ship again. The engines roared to life, and the sleek black vessel lifted off, disappearing into the hazy sky. As the sound faded, Rhea let out a shaky breath. You actually made them leave," she said. David lowered his spear, finally relaxing. "Sometimes," he said, "the only thing scarier than a big gun is someone who won't back down." Rhea looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't just surviving. He wasn't just fixing things and building shelters. He was protecting something. He was protecting her. But after spending weeks with David, she began to see what made them unique. He was stubborn, yes. Reckless, absolutely. But he was also creative, determined, and endlessly adaptable. Rhea had never met anyone who could take a shattered piece of metal and turn it into a working hinge, or who could patch a wall with nothing more than grit and imagination. David wasn't afraid to fail. He just tried again until it worked. And that was something she admired. A small victory. One afternoon, as they were reinforcing a new section of the shelter, David called out, "Hey, Rhea, come here." She wiped the sweat from her brow and walked over. David stood by a small makeshift table. On it was a device, a communicator cobbled together from salvaged parts. "It's not much," he said, picking it up, "but it might just be enough to reach someone out there." Rhea stared at it. For weeks, she had given up hope of contacting anyone beyond this planet. Every signal she'd sent before had been ignored. Why would this time be different? But David wasn't the kind of person to quit, even when the odds were slim. "Go ahead," he said, holding it out to her. "Give it a shot." Her hand shook as she took the device. She didn't know what to say, who to call. But she pressed the button and spoke anyway. "This is Rhea of the Zephyrian people," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I am stranded on Cyrus 7 with one human survivor. We have food and water, but not much else. If anyone hears this, please respond." The static crackled, and her words disappeared into the void. David didn't say anything, just went back to work on the wall. Rhea held the communicator for a moment longer, then set it down. They didn't hear anything that day, or the next. But the point wasn't that someone would respond. The point was that they tried. A home from nothing. In the weeks that followed, the shelter became more than just a place to survive. Rhea planted a small patch of hardy vegetation. It wasn't much, just a few scraggly shoots that could withstand the harsh climate. But it was something living, something growing. David expanded the fire pit into a proper cooking area. He rigged up a simple filtration system that made their water cleaner, easier to store. They found a rhythm, a purpose. And Rhea began to see their shelter for what it really was, a home. It wasn't made of steel and glass like the Zephyrian cities. It didn't have the sleek, glowing walls and humming machines she had once taken for granted. It was a collection of scraps and effort, of mistakes and adjustments. It was the product of two people who refused to give up, who worked through the pain, the fear, and the odds. Rhea stared at the patch of green growing outside the shelter and felt a warmth she hadn't known in a long time. "I think it's going to last," she said one evening, sitting by the fire. David looked up from his work, his expression calm and steady as always. "Yeah," he said simply, "I think it will." The final realization. Rhea hadn't realized how much she'd changed until she saw her reflection in a piece of polished metal. The face staring back wasn't the same person who had been abandoned on this planet. Her skin, once smooth and unblemished, now bore the marks of work and survival. Her eyes were harder, sharper, but also more alive. She wasn't a helpless outcast anymore. David had taught her, though not with words. His way of teaching was through action, through silent encouragement, and the occasional nod of approval. And she had learned. She had become something her own people never expected her to be: capable, strong, and unbreakable. That night, as she and David sat by the fire, the distant hum of an approaching ship echoed in the distance. But this time, Rhea wasn't afraid. Whatever came next, she would face it. She wasn't alone. And she wasn't the same person who had been abandoned. Because in the harshest, loneliest place in the galaxy, a human had built her a home from nothing.